The most disturbing part of this story isn't that someone broke into the house. It's that they had apparently been living there for days, maybe longer, while the owner slept just a few feet away. The night it happened started with an argument, not the kind of disagreement that blows over in a few minutes, but the kind that drags on for hours and turns every small mistake into another reason to fight. My wife and I had argued before, plenty of times, but that particular evening felt different. Everything I did seemed to irritate her. Every sentence I spoke led to another complaint. The final straw came after I forgot to put the toilet seat down. It sounds ridiculous now, but the moment she noticed, she exploded. Her voice echoed through the house as she launched into another lecture. She wasn't just annoyed about the toilet seat anymore. Suddenly, it was about every mistake I'd ever made, every unfinished project, every flaw she could think of. I stood there listening while exhaustion settled deeper into my bones. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Paul. "Hey man," I said when he answered. "Any chance I can crash at your place tonight?" "Of course," he replied immediately. "Come over." Less than an hour later, I was pulling into his driveway. Paul lived alone in a huge house. Ironically, that was another thing my wife often complained about. She constantly compared our home to the homes of my friends, and Paul's place was usually at the top of that list. The house looked even larger at night. Warm yellow lights glowed behind massive windows, and the property sat in complete silence beneath a dark sky. The moment I stepped inside, the tension from the evening began to fade. Paul handed me a beer. "What happened this time?" he asked. I laughed bitterly. "You really want the full story?" For the next hour, we sat in his living room drinking and talking. The conversation drifted from relationships to work, then eventually to random memories from years ago. At one point, Paul told me I could stay as long as I needed, but I shook my head. "Nah, just one night. I'll figure things out tomorrow." At the time, I thought the worst part of my day was already over. I had no idea that before sunrise, both of us would discover we hadn't been alone in that house. A little before midnight, Paul showed me where I'd be sleeping. The layout of the upstairs hallway immediately struck me as strange. 3 guest bedrooms sat side by side in a perfectly straight line. Directly across from them was Paul's bedroom. As we walked down the hall, he pointed toward the rooms. "You're in this one," he said. The bedroom was larger than most hotel rooms I'd stayed in. Clean sheets covered the bed, and everything looked untouched. What seemed odd was that Paul mentioned he rarely used the guest rooms. In fact, he told me he had only ever needed one of them. "The other 2 mostly stay empty," he said casually. I didn't think much of it. After saying goodnight, I shut the door and collapsed onto the mattress. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. For a while I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak that old houses make during the night. Then I heard something, a soft sound. At first it was easy to dismiss. Maybe shifting pipes, maybe the wind. But a few minutes later it came again. Scrape, then another. Scrape. The noise seemed to be coming from the room directly beside mine. I rolled over and buried my face in the pillow. The sound continued. Slow, rhythmic, like someone moving carefully around furniture. Eventually, annoyance replaced curiosity. I climbed out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The house felt colder outside the bedroom. The neighboring door stood motionless in the darkness. I walked over and tried the handle. Locked. That immediately felt strange. Why lock an empty guest room? I crossed the hallway and gently opened Paul's bedroom door. He was already under the blankets. "What?" he mumbled sleepily. "There's some weird noise coming from the room next to mine." He blinked at me. "What noise? You don't hear it?" He listened for a moment. Nothing. The sound had stopped. I asked why the room was locked. Paul shrugged. "Personal stuff. I keep some belongings in there." Then he added, "Go back to bed. If it keeps happening, come get me." His calm attitude eased my nerves. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the house was settling. So I returned to my room. And strangely enough, the noises disappeared completely. For the next 30 minutes, everything remained silent. My eyes grew heavy. Sleep finally began pulling me under. Then, from the other side of the wall, I heard a single tap. A few seconds later, another. And then something that made every hair on my body stand up. A voice. The voice was barely audible, so faint that I couldn't make out any words. But it was unmistakably human. I sat upright instantly. My heart began hammering against my ribs. For several seconds I listened without moving. The room was dark. The hallway beyond the door was darker. Then I heard another sound. A whisper. Again, too quiet to understand. That was enough. I jumped out of bed and hurried across the hall. This time, when Paul opened the door, he could tell from my face that something was wrong. "I heard someone," I said. His expression changed immediately. "Someone? In that room?" He stared at me for a moment. Then he reached into a dresser drawer and pulled out a set of keys. Without another word, we stepped into the hallway. The atmosphere felt completely different now. No longer annoying. No longer strange. Dangerous. Paul approached the locked guest room beside mine. The metal key clicked inside the lock. The sound seemed unusually loud in the silence. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The moment the door swung inward, a rush of cold air hit us. The window on the far side of the room was wide open. So was the closet. Paul immediately switched on the light. The room looked mostly normal at first glance. But then we noticed the bed. The blankets were wrinkled. Deep impressions marked the mattress. Fresh impressions, as if someone had been lying there not long ago. Neither of us spoke. We began searching. Closet, drawers, under the bed, every corner. What we found raised even more questions. Scattered throughout the closet were empty bags and discarded items that definitely didn't belong there. Meanwhile, several valuables Paul remembered storing in the room were gone. Completely gone. The realization hit both of us at nearly the same moment. Someone had been inside. Not just tonight. Recently. Maybe repeatedly. Paul suddenly sprinted from the room. For a second, I didn't understand why. Then I remembered. There was another locked guest room. The third bedroom. If someone had been hiding in one room, what if someone was hiding in the other? I followed him down the hallway. The key shook slightly in his hand as he inserted it into the lock. Neither of us knew what was waiting on the other side. But deep down, I think we both feared the same thing. We were about to find out that the noises weren't coming from an empty room. They were coming from someone who had been living inside the house. The lock clicked. Paul threw the door open. Everything happened in an instant. The moment the door swung inward, a dark figure exploded into motion. A person, not a shadow, not a trick of the light, an actual person. The figure raced across the room and launched through the open window. For a split second, I only stood there frozen. The silhouette disappeared onto the patio roof outside. Paul reacted first. "Go!" We both rushed toward the window. The roof below stretched into darkness. For a moment, we could hear movement. Rapid footsteps. Then nothing. Paul looked ready to jump after him. Thankfully, neither of us did. Instead, we sprinted downstairs and burst through the back door, hoping to cut the intruder off before he escaped. The night air hit us immediately, cool and damp. We searched the yard, the side of the house, the driveway. Nothing. The person was gone. Completely gone. The silence that followed felt surreal. Only minutes earlier someone had been inside the house. Now there wasn't a trace of movement anywhere. Eventually, we returned upstairs. That's when we started noticing details we had missed in our panic. And what we found was far more unsettling than the brief glimpse of the intruder. The bed in the room had clearly been used. White sheets were stained with blood. Not enough to suggest a violent scene, but enough to make both of us uncomfortable. The closet contained another disturbing discovery. Sitting on the floor was a butter knife Paul had reported missing days earlier. Small blood spots marked the blade. Nearby were additional signs that someone had been spending significant time inside the room. This wasn't a quick burglary. This wasn't someone who broke in for an hour. Someone had settled in. Someone had slept there, eaten there, hidden there, possibly for days. As we continued looking around, the pieces started coming together. Paul remembered valuables that had disappeared over the previous week. Jewelry, cash, various belongings. Things he had assumed were simply misplaced. Now it all made sense. The thefts weren't random. They had been happening from inside the house. The realization sent a chill through me. While we had been sitting downstairs drinking beer earlier that night, someone may have been hiding only a few rooms away. Listening, waiting, watching, and perhaps most terrifying of all, they already knew the house far better than we did. By the time police were notified and everything had been examined, one conclusion seemed unavoidable. The intruders hadn't just broken into the house. They had been living there. Exactly how long remained unclear. But based on the condition of the rooms, the missing property, and the evidence left behind, it appeared they had occupied those guest bedrooms for more than a week, possibly longer. The thought was horrifying. Every day Paul had gone to work believing he lived alone. Every night he had locked his bedroom door and gone to sleep without realizing strangers were only a few feet away. Strangers who had access to his belongings, his food, his routines, his entire life. Suddenly, several odd things Paul had mentioned earlier that evening made sense. While we were drinking, he'd casually complained about how quickly food seemed to disappear from his kitchen. At the time we laughed about it. Paul was thin, almost unusually thin, yet somehow groceries vanished at a pace that never seemed logical. Now we understood why. Someone else had been eating them. Someone hidden inside the house. The more we discussed it, the worse it became. How many times had they watched him walk through the hallway? How often had they waited silently while he sat downstairs? Had they listened to his conversations? Had they stood behind those locked doors while guests visited? There was no way to know. And that uncertainty was the most unsettling part. The stolen valuables were gone. The intruders were gone. And despite the evidence left behind, finding them proved impossible. Whoever jumped from that window disappeared into the darkness and never returned. Investigators never identified the people responsible. No arrests were made. No clear answers were found. As far as anyone knows, they were likely homeless individuals who discovered an opportunity and took advantage of it. But whether they were simply desperate or genuinely dangerous remains unanswered. What isn't unanswered is how close things came to becoming much worse. Had I ignored the sounds? Had I dismissed the whispers? Had I decided not to wake Paul? Those people might have remained inside the house for days, weeks, or even longer. To this day, whenever I think back on that night, one image always returns. A locked guest bedroom, a faint voice through the wall, and the terrifying realization that while we believed the house was empty, someone else was already living there.